Hello, welcome everyone to another presentation by Dr. Brian Janeway. Today we're going to be talking about latest discoveries in biblical archaeology. And I'm excited to learn about the new stuff discovered recently. And I'm excited to have Dr. Janeway back with us now. And go for it. Looking forward to hearing you.
Well, thank you, Zach. And it's good to see you again. It's been too long. It's been well over a year, I think it has, since we did our Shroud of Turin talks. So back again here. Thankful to be back at Plymouth to be able to talk about what I have a passion for, that is archaeology in the Bible and what it can tell us and show us and corroborate and strengthen our faith and provide a strong apologetic for the things that we read and we take by faith. But it's always good to have that evidence and know that it's solidly grounded in reality and historical reality. So I put together this talk as sort of a catch-all of some of the latest discoveries that maybe didn't fit into some of the other talks I've given along the way. And so we have a couple of Old Testament and a couple of New Testament discoveries that relate very closely to specific events and verses and people in the Bible. So I like to have sort of a theme verse for my talks. And the one I picked today comes out of the New Testament, and it's when Jesus is he's being reprimanded by the Pharisees. It says some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." But Jesus answered them and said, "I tell you, if these become silent, the stones will cry out." And that's something that some archaeologists in the biblical world like to use as a way of sort of highlighting the testimony of archaeology. The stones, the ancient things that we dig up and stuff actually do testify themselves to the truth of the Bible. So this, even though that's not what Jesus necessarily had in mind, he was saying that the stones themselves can lend witness to the truth of me and the gospel. And so that's what we're looking at here, is ancient things that speak to us through the ages and can testify and corroborate and to the truth of the Bible. So there are a couple of verses I like to ground the practice of archaeology in a biblical sense in. 1 Peter 3:15 is, "But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence." So it's a call to all Christians to make a defense. The Greek word there is apologia, which is making an apologetic. It's not though saying I'm sorry, it's making a reasoned defense for what we believe in. And that can come in many forms. It can come in a personal way of testimony and what God has done in your life and doing. It can be historical, and can be philosophical, it can be archaeological, which is my particular forte. But that's what we're all called to do. Now, Jude 3 says, "Beloved, while I was making every effort to write you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, appealing that you contend earnestly for the faith, which was once and for all handed down to the saints." So we're to contend for the faith. And then to go back to the Old Testament, which is quoted in 3 of the Gospels. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." And I'm highlighting here the mind part of it. We can have our faith, we can have our earnestness and our zeal for and our love for God, but we need to engage our minds as well, our intellects, and make intelligent defenses and advance the gospel in every way that we can. So I like to show a couple of the popular magazines and journals that if you're more interested, if you want to go deeper into these things, or maybe subscribe. There's one called Artifacts, which kind of captures all the latest headlines in regular news reports about archaeological discoveries. I find it very helpful to highlight things that I want to then further investigate, and then I can go in and find more details in the journals and stuff about these discoveries. Probably the most popular archaeological magazine for biblical people is Biblical Archaeology Review. It's been around a long time. It has great articles and great photography and authors that are actually doing work in the field. So it's a great magazine. Some of my colleagues like to kind of dismiss it sometimes as being, it's just like for lay people or commoners. It's not sophisticated, but the fact is it's a great magazine. It has great data, and it's written by the top scholars that are doing work in the field. And then Bible and Spade, which is part of the Ministry of Associates for Biblical Research, which is how I got my start in archaeology. And this is very much biblical archaeological. It's sort of patterned after Biblical Archaeology Review, sort of a poor man's BAR, but it's also very worthy and valuable as a resource. You can find that at the website biblearchaeology.org. So we come to our first artifact today, the Bethlehem Bula. Now, this is just a tiny little piece of clay that's been hardened, and it has an inscription on it. So anytime we can find an inscription of any kind, it's extremely valuable. We don't have a lot of inscriptions from the Holy Land, as opposed to the great civilizations on either side. Down in Egypt, we have thousands and thousands of monumental inscriptions in stone, in temples, and in tombs. Just a wealth, a treasure trove of inscriptions. And then we also have the same thing up in Mesopotamia, from originally a Sumerian language into the Akkadian, and then the great civilizations of the Babylonians and the Assyrians. We have just loads and loads of annals and inscriptions, but in the land between, as it's often called, between the two great civilizations, not that much. So whenever we find something, we get all excited about it. This particular one, as is often the case, is sort of an accidental find. So the circumstances around this find were, we go back to about 1999 and the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And by mutual agreement, the Muslims and the Jews are not supposed to undertake any archaeological excavation on the Temple Mount because it's a holy site for both religions. And so it's necessarily, they're very careful about that, and they try not to break that. But it just so turned out that the Muslims wanted to build another mosque, and there are several up on the Temple Mount, in addition to the famous Dome on the Rock with the gold dome. So they, by night, went in and took about 30 or 40 truckloads of material and dug it out, and then went and dumped it in the Kidron Valley and covered it up with garbage so that no one would find it. But they did find out about it. And so what some enterprising young grad student and his mentor did was to go and retrieve that material and begin a sifting project where they were sifting through every handload, every bucket load of dirt to see what they could find. And they have found a lot of very neat things. This is still going on, by the way. This has been going on for, I think, over 15 years now, this sifting project. It's called the Temple Mount Sifting Project. So they found this little bulla, which is what they used to seal documents with. So you would have a seal impression, a seal called a bulla, and then you would impress it onto a piece of wet clay that you would use to seal the documents. And you would leave an imprint on it with usually the name of the owner of the scroll. So you would have belonging to XX, whatever the name is. Now this one is broken, but there is enough preserved to find out some significant information. For example, it's in the 7th on the top register. So you have 3 registers here, and obviously it's broken away a little bit on the sides, but it says Bishvat in the 7th. And then the second line is, as soon as I bring it up, Bethlehem, and then in the year to the king, or belonging to the king. So this dates to about 700 BC. It's the Bethlehem Bula. It was found in Jerusalem in that sifting project. So it was up where on the Temple Mount, below the level of the current pavement where they were digging out material. So we don't know which king this was, but it was probably during the reigns of one of the other of Hezekiah, Manasseh, or Josiah, right around 700 BC plus or minus. It's not as important to know which king it is, but the fact that it mentions Bethlehem is very significant because this is the oldest inscription that we have of Bethlehem outside of the Bible that is written on an inscription. So it's the first time that we find the name Bethlehem on an inscription outside of the Bible. It's actually a fiscal or administrative bulla. So it was used to send shipments of taxes or taxes in kind to the capital from the outlying cities and provinces. So this would be probably sent on an annual basis, remittances to Jerusalem in the form of silver or agricultural produce such as wine or wheat or maybe olive oil. And then it would be sealed with the the point of origin, this in this case being Bethlehem, and then sent up to Jerusalem. It was found in 2012 by the Temple Mount Sifting Project, and this is just a picture of someone sifting through. They dump out the material, then they kind of wash it over with water and rinse off the dirt, and then they can look through all the pieces to see what they find. And they have found some other inscriptions too, and all kinds of other very interesting objects. But this is probably the most important one that they've found so far. So the name Bethlehem, it means house of bread, but it's also derived from the name of the Akkadian god of fertility, Lechem. So some people don't subscribe to this, but it is a theory that traces it back to the Akkadian language before it was part of the Hebrew language. It's possibly means that it was the site of a temple or a house, that is, to the god Lechem. When they excavated, they haven't done a lot of excavations of Bethlehem, but when they did do some, they found a number of tombs and pottery sherds that date the occupation of that site going back to the Bronze Age, which is into the 2000s BC, and also into the Iron Age, but they haven't found any actual buildings or architectural remains yet. Now, they do have another instance where Bethlehem is mentioned in a group of texts or letters called the Amarna Letters that were sent to Egypt, to the Pharaoh, during the time of the 14th century BC. That's in the 1300s, when the town was Canaanite. And these letters were written by officials of the various Canaanite cities to the Pharaoh down in Amarna, in his capital city in Egypt, appealing for help to deal with various problems. And they were having problems with these marauding people called Apiru, which very well could be the first Israelites or Hebrews that were coming into the land after Moses first came in, and then Joshua, of course, leading them across the Jordan River. So this particular letter mentions Bethlehem, and the governor of Jerusalem, whose name was Abdu-Hepa, he's appealing to the Pharaoh to come and help out with some of his military forces to put down and take back the village of Bethlehem from the Apiru. Apparently the Apiru had taken control of it for a time. So this is the first mention we have of Bethlehem in history, but then the inscription is the first actual inscription that mentions Bethlehem. Now I pulled up a picture of this god, Lachmu, hairy, meaning hairy. He's a Mesopotamian god of protection from demons, often placed in the house and building foundations. Kind of obscure, but that's possibly where the word Bethlehem originally comes from. And when the Bible, in the Old Testament, Bethlehem is associated with a place called Ephrathah or Ephrata. And that could be another name for Bethlehem, or it could be maybe the province or the region in which Bethlehem is located. Now, this is, it's first mentioned as being on the way where Rachel dies and is buried on the way to Bethlehem in the book of Genesis. And the descendants of Judah, after they had come into the land, settled there. This was a part of the tribal allotment that they were given. And so the family of Boaz in the book of Ruth we read about were in this area. And in the valley to the east is where Ruth of Moab gleaned the fields and then returned to town with Naomi. And then the whole story of the book of Ruth follows on after that. This is the context and the place where it took place. It was also the home of Jesse, the father of King David, and the site of his anointing by the prophet Samuel. Now, to go further, this is where I find it quite interesting. This is one of my favorite prophecies, biblical or messianic prophecies, from Micah chapter 5, verse 2. It says, "But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity." Now, this book would have been written in or about the 7th or the 6th, probably the 7th century BC by the prophet Micah. And he mentions Bethlehem as being the origin or the birthplace of the one who is coming for me, for God, to be ruler in Israel. And this, of course, Christians believe is speaking about prophetically about Jesus. And finally, of course, this is the traditional birthplace of Jesus, Bethlehem. And that actually goes back to being venerated as the site of the birthplace, going back to the time of Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century AD. And it wasn't too long after that, once Christianity had become a legalized religion in the Roman Empire under the Emperor Constantine the Great, whose mother was a Christian and probably brought her son to faith. Queen Helena then went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and started to mark out some of the holy sites for the first time, where they then built royally sanctioned cathedrals or large churches on these very famous sites. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, and the Church of Annunciation up in Nazareth. So that was the early 4th century, around about 325 AD. So that's when we first find a church built on the site of what was a cave that was held to be the traditional location of the birth of Jesus. Okay, so now we move to our second inscription. And this one is called a Jeruba inscription. And this is brand new, just about a month or two old. And I kind of got excited about this because it comes from an earlier period, the book of Judges. We don't have very much inscribed material at all from any time before the time of Kings, really, and a little bit during the time of David. We have a couple of inscriptions that mention David, but they're actually from 150 years after David's reign. But we go all the way back to about 1100 BC and during the period of the Judges for this inscription. And it was found at a site where I was actually digging 2 years ago. And it was only about 6 months later when they returned to the site for a summer season. I was there during February. They found this inscription. So I wasn't on site when they found it, but they just announced it a couple of months ago as their discovery from the site is called Khirbet al-Rai. Now we're going to go through a little bit on Gideon. You have a whole host of different judges who arise during times of crisis. So just to set this chronologically within the broad spectrum of biblical history, you have Moses coming, leading his people for 40 years through the desert and up to the promised land, where he's only allowed to look in to the promised land, into the Jordan River Valley and over to Jericho. But it's then given to Joshua to actually lead the people across the River Jordan, then to conquer Jericho and then the land of Canaan from the people who were living there at the time. So they go ahead and they start to conquer some of those cities, but they don't complete the conquest of Canaan. And so for several hundred years, they're living amongst the Canaanites, who are still occupying some of the cities, and the Israelites are occupying other ones. We have a lot of strife and tension where some of the tribes of Israel are fighting against one another, because they're all given their tribal allotments, and some of them go and some of them don't go to their tribal allotments. And so there's disobedience. They don't follow God's command to take control of the land completely. And so they're afflicted for centuries of time with warfare and strife and division. So that's the period of the book of Judges. And so you have a number of these judges coming up for a period of time, and then they kind of melt away and go away once the crisis has passed. So Gideon, it turns out, more is written about Gideon than any other judge except for Samson, who's another very famous judge who, of course, we have the story about Samson and Delilah. Delilah was a Philistine, and he had relations with her, and he got into all kinds of trouble. But that's Samson. So Gideon, we go back to chapter 6 in the book of Judges, and just to sort of hit the high points here, and forgive some of these funny cartoons, but I try to find something to actually illustrate instead of just telling you or talking about it or reading a verse. So Israel at this time was oppressed. That is, they were being dominated by Midian, the Midianites. And then an angel of the Lord appears to Gideon while he's treading grapes on a threshing floor. And that's in chapter 6. So he comes along and he says, "The Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. Go in this your strength and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian." So he's being called by God through his angel to go and lead his people to deliver them from the oppression of the Midianites. Now, his first task that he's asked to do is to knock down the altar to Baal that his own father had, that is Gideon's father. So he's instructed to go and pull down the altar of Baal, which belongs to his father, and to cut down the Asherah that is beside it. Now, the Asherah would have been a representation, some kind of a wooden representation of the goddess Asherah. So you have Baal and Asherah. It's like mom and dad god of the Canaanites, Baal and his consort Asherah. So these were obviously forbidden to be worshipped by the Israelites, and they were instructed, of course, to remain faithful to their one true God, Yahweh. but already they were falling into idolatry and they were adopting the ways of the Canaanites. So Gideon's being instructed to tear down the altar of his own father, who was worshiping Baal and Asherah. So here's a picture of him, an artist's rendition of pulling down the bull, which is the representation of Baal, and then the Asherah pole. So Gideon, at this point, he fulfills the command, and he's given a new name. The new name is Jerubbaal, and that is to say, let Baal contend against him. That's one of the translations of this name that's given in the book of Judges. So he's faithful in that command, and then now he's to go about and to do greater things. But Gideon is still unsure, and he wants to make sure he has God's blessing and that he's chosen by God and God's going to be with him. So we have the story of the fleece, where he asks God to wet the fleece when everything else is dry around it, and then to dry the fleece when everything else is wet around it. So this is a depiction of God actually doing that in the presence of Gideon. And so Gideon then is affirmed, and he's given confidence to go then and form up an army. And in a very strange instructions here, he's told to bring these men down to the river to drink, and he's to separate them based upon how they drink the water. It says, "You shall separate everyone who laps the water with their tongue as a dog laps, as well as everyone who kneels to drink." So the ones who are lapping up the water like a dog, and you can see some of them here doing that. And then other ones who were kneeling to drink. We don't have that here, but I think we may have it here in this other portrayal of it. So those people are not to be chosen. And then he takes his 300 and he goes and he conquers the Midianites. He takes 300 of his men, and he's instructed to blow the trumpets and smash these pitchers, which they have lights in them, or torches, some kind of a lit torch, maybe using olive oil or something like that. And they're to frighten the camp of the Midianites and to make it seem as if they're much more numerous than they really are. So this ploy works, and he wins a great victory against the Midianites, and he delivers Israel. So that's the end of the story of Gideon, about 3 chapters in the book of Judges. So now we return back to a place called Khirbet al-Rai, which is down here. Now you see here, this is Philistia, where they're living along the coastline. The Israelites are living in the hill country, right down the center of the country. So you can see here that they're kind of in a border zone where they're clashing with the Philistines during this time. Now, Khirbet al-Rai is a very small hilltop site. It's a beautiful place, actually, and it's like a natural preserve here where they've planted a whole forests of trees since 49 or 48. So, and then there's a beautiful groves of almond trees that were in bloom when I was digging there in February. But you can see this is just a fairly small hilltop site. And there were 3 areas that they've excavated here. This one in the top, in the middle, and this one down here. The area down here is where they found this inscription. So a little bit of geography. We're looking west out towards the coastal plain of Philistia. And then to the east, we're getting up into the hills called the Shephelah, or the Shphelah. And then that leads up to the central hill country. And here's another blow up. Now, area A over here is where they found the inscription. Now we're zooming down into the very area where they found it. So we've got sandbags lining the area of excavation here. You can see wall lines and buildings. In this area down here, they found a pit. So this pit is what it looks like here once they finished emptying it out. So it was typical of ancients to dig pits. I mean, they were still digging pits down the colonial period where they were throwing garbage out in the backyard. They would dig a pit and they'd throw their garbage, and it would accumulate over time and eventually would fill up. But archaeologists love pits because there's all kinds of great stuff that they threw away that's preserved in the pits. And it may have been in use for quite some time. So you have a stratification of the pitting, especially in a big pit like this. So what happened was, at some point, they dug into earlier levels of the city and they dug this pit. And then when the excavators, and they started filling it up with garbage and stuff, broken pottery and the like. So when they excavated this pit, they found broken pottery and a couple of pieces of this inscription, which you see here pictured and then drawn. And it has, I think, 7 letters on it. There's 2 pieces they joined together here, and then a third piece they think belongs over here to the left. Now, of course, Hebrew reads from right to left. So you have here the name of Jerubbaal, which is the name that had been given to Gideon. So, and it's also contemporary with Gideon. In Judges chapter 6, we would date to roughly about 1100 BC. So this is contemporary with Gideon, and it's a name that's common only during the period of Judges. It's not a common name found later at all. So it actually matches with what appears to be a real name used during the period of the Judges in around 1100 BC. Now, we would ask the question, well, is this actually Gideon's jar? And that's a question we probably can never answer for sure. You know, it's oftentimes that you find a name on a jar like this, meaning, and it would be the owner of that jar putting his name on it, saying, this is my jar, essentially. But in this case, we don't have the belonging to, but it's probably belonging to Jeruba. Now, it so happens that Gideon operated up in the Jezreel Valley, which is in the northern part of the country. This Khirbet al-Rai site is in the south part of the country. Now, it's not impossible that it could be Jeruba come down to Khirbet al-Rai, which may actually be the name, the biblical name of Ziklag, but we're not quite sure about that. But at the very least, it's the same name. It could be a name that was fairly common during that time, but it's very coincidental that it's very contemporary with Gideon and Jeruba from Judges chapter 6. So pretty amazing find. Okay, we move to our next discovery, which is Naboth's vineyard. Now, you may be familiar with the story of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. This is very colorful and dramatic and graphic as well. This whole story of Naboth's vineyard and how King Ahab wanted to have it for himself. And we'll go into some of that story later, but I wanted to show you a little bit of the geography here. Here we have Tel Jezreel in the middle of this picture, and then the spring of Ayin Jezreel, which was their water source, right down here in the fields. Now, this is the Jezreel Valley, a very famous valley that cuts right across the sort of the middle of Israel from east to west. It connects the coast to the Jordan River Valley, which you can see in the distance here. And those mountains up at the top here are from in what is today Jordan. And in ancient times, that was Moab. So those are the mountains of Moab up there. And the Jordan River would be in the foreground. You can't quite see it, but it would be right along here. So it's a very strategic area. Tel Megiddo is located just a few miles to the west of us. And this Tel Jezreel is at the most narrowmost point of the Jezreel Valley. So it's very strategic. So here we have Ayin Jezreel, and Mount Gilboa was a famous place where King Saul fought against the Philistines and met his end, and he ended up committing suicide rather than fall into the hands of the Philistines. So that's where Saul meets his maker, and he falls on his sword, and the Philistines take his body and they attach it to a temple as sort of a war trophy over at the site of Beit Sha'an, which is just around the corner of Mount Gilboa here where the battle took place, where Saul was nailed up to the wall. There's the mountains of Moab. This is a view from Tel Jezreel. You can see maybe a little bit better the mountains of Moab out there. This is the spring over here to the right. Here's another close-up of the spring. This is actually, I was just here 2 weeks ago, and this is a very popular watering hole for people to go swimming, for families to go. It's actually a fairly large area, and they have picnic benches and things like that, and the kids are swimming in a nice cool water in the trees. So it's kind of a nice recreation area. Now that's looking across the valley at its narrowmost point to the north. And so I told you that it's a very strategic spot. When they first excavated here years ago, they found that there was an enclosure, like a fortified space. It wasn't a city, and there's really not a city to speak of here, just a very thin settlement, but this enclosure was fairly significant, and it dates to the time of King Ahab. So they found a couple of towers on a couple of the corners to the northeast and to the southeast, and a gate on the south side, as well as a moat that was actually cut around the walls too. So it was a pretty substantial fortified enclosure where probably provisions, soldiers, chariots, horses could all be kept inside that enclosure at a place that was very strategic to launch armies from at Tel Jezreel. So in the biblical text, now Ahab is said that he calls this his house, whatever this enclosure, which is what we think it was. The narrator of this story calls it a hekal, which is a loan word from the Akkadian from the word ikalu, which means great house. Now that could be a temple, it could be a palace, but it could be something else. The excavator most recent of this area relates it to a term called Ikal Masarti, which is a review palace or a military headquarters of sorts. As I said, there's really not much of an evidence of a town settlement here on the tell that's been discovered yet. Rather, she calls it was more like an army mustering station, this enclosure. This is some rough outlines of what they found in the enclosure. So here you have a couple of the towers. Here's the gate on the south side. They didn't excavate the whole thing, but there was definitely an open area in the middle. It was not built up inside the walls. So that leads them to believe that it was a military enclosure. Now this shows some of the geography on the tell. Here we're looking east, and this is where the enclosure was located. And then just right down here was where they found a winery, just down the hill from where the enclosure is located. And here's a nice aerial shot. That's an outline of where the enclosure was. The winery was right down here on the lowest. This is like a terracing area here, agricultural terraces that were built. And of course, very productive and rich fields up and down the Jezreel Valley. There's a blow up of the area. So this is actually what they found, cuttings in the bedrock that had all the makings of a wine production facility. This would have been located right amongst the vineyards around it and in the fields below it. So a very centrally located vineyard to take advantage of the rich agricultural fields that were surrounding it. So we have about 130 square foot complex here. It's located next to very fertile agricultural terracing and the spring. It has a number of cuttings in the rock, like a treading floor, which is number one here, this big square area where they presumably were treading the grapes. 34 square feet, 2A and B is here and here, rectangular vats that are 14 square feet and about 3 feet deep, and a number of other cuttings. There's a basin, number 3, numerous mortars and pits all around the area. You see them blown up here on the bottom, 3 of their pits. Now, this is the video that I will play. We had a little trouble here with the audio, but let's see if we can get it to work. Okay, so it's not going to work, the audio, but what I'll just try to say is what I was saying here. This is what could be the Naboth, the Vineyard of Nabaths from the Book of Kings. Now, they speculated that based on the dating of the enclosure and other structures they found in the area, and also the type of vineyard here, they compared it to other known vineyards and how it was arranged and cut into the bedrock, and believed that it was contemporary with the time of Naboth, which would be around the time of King Ahab, say, or in the 8th century, the 9th to the 8th century BC. And then it was in use for centuries after that time. So the main form of dating was sort of indirect in that they looked at the types of vineyards and how they were set up, and it looks like it goes back to that time period. So that's what you're looking at here. And it's quite an amazing find because there haven't been too many of these found, but the fact that it was found at Jezreel, one of the very famous story about Naboth. So what happened here was King Ahab asked him if he would sell his vineyard to him, and Naboth, it was a family vineyard. He didn't want any part of it. He said, basically go jump in a lake. I'm not going to sell you my vineyard. So Ahab was flummoxed and he was frustrated. He didn't know what to do. And so Queen Jezebel steps in at that point and says, I'll take care of things. So she arranges for sort of a frame job. So that she invites him with some people, some ne'er-do-wells, to have some kind of a dinner for him in honor of him. And then they accuse him falsely, and then they end up stoning him to death. And so then Ahab and Jezebel take control of the vineyard. But of course, they're cursed. And Jezebel there's a prophecy that the dogs will eat her. She'll meet her demise, and the dogs will eat her up. And the only thing that will be left will be the palms of her hands. And so that sordid story takes place in the setting of a couple of kings who were fighting against the Moabites, and King Jehu is anointed by one of Elisha's, the prophet Elisha's followers, to be king in Israel, to overthrow King Ahaz King Joram, and to actually have a military coup. And so Jehu rides back in his chariot to Jezreel, where Ahab has now passed away, but Joram is the king. So he actually kills Joram, and then he has the attendants of Jezebel, who is apparently standing up and looking out of the window from the second or third story. He has their attendants throw her down and kill her in the fall, and then the dogs proceed to eat her body. And when they come back out again, Jehu goes in, and then when he comes back out again, there's nothing left of Jezebel except for her palms of her hands. So it fulfills a prophecy that she was judged by. Now, these were some of my travel mates the other day when we were at the winery, and I had them reenact a little bit of wine treading here. So they're just doing a little bit of treading here, and unfortunately we can't hear it, but you can see them just a few seconds here where they're going to simulate what it was like to tread grapes at Naboth's vineyard. Now, a very interesting find related to this is a seal like the one we had earlier from Bethlehem, but this is much more ornate and has a number of letters on it, which could have been Jezebel's seal. Now, it's not totally agreed that this is authentic, but it's a very fascinating object nonetheless. So it reconstructs a couple of the letters up here that are broken off, which is almost always la. That means belonging to, as I had mentioned earlier, belonging to the person who is making the seal, who's then putting it on a wet piece of clay to seal a document tied up with a string, a scroll of papyrus, then has the owner's name on it that's pressed into the wet clay. Now, this dates to about the 9th century. It says belonging to Jezebel, and it has just the consonants, which is how they write the ancient Hebrew and Canaanite. And then you have to fill in the vowels yourself. But if you knew the language well, you would know what the vowels were. So it says belonging to, and that's reconstructed up in the broken part, Yod Zion Beth Lamed, Jezebel or Jezebel. Now, it has some very interesting iconography here too. Now, Jezebel itself means, where is His Highness Baal? So we know that she was the daughter of a Phoenician king by the name of Ethbaal. And so when she came in and married into Ahab, she brought with her Phoenician religious practices and stuff that were forbidden for the Israelites and for King Ahab to follow, but they did anyway. So she's considered a very evil influence on Ahab and on Israel at that time. And she persecuted the prophets of God, of course. Now, she, being the daughter of Phoenician king Ethbaal, it identifies her as a Canaanite goddess, Anat, who's a Canaanite goddess, or an Egyptian Hathor Isis, beloved of Baal. Her name is correctly spelled according to the way it's spelled in the Bible. So it's Yod Zion Beit Lamed, Jezebel. Some of the iconography looks very Egyptian. This is like a sphinx, so you can see here on the top register with wings. And that's very common for the Phoenicians to imitate Egyptian iconography. They had close relations with Egypt over many centuries, they did, or to say Lebanon, that is ancient Phoenicia. It has a female face on the Sphinx and a crown that's in the style of Hathor, which is one of the gods of Egypt. And also has an ankh. You'll recognize, perhaps some of you here, that looks like a cross with a circle on the top. And that's an Egyptian symbol of life. It has a winged disc up here on the top or in the middle. And then the double uraeus, which are snakes or cobras with like a disc over them, which is another way of representing deity. And then a falcon, which is actually how Hathor is represented. So it's very Egyptianizing this, which wouldn't be surprising if it was Jezebel, who was a Phoenician, imitating these Egyptian forms. So letters Yod and Lamed are also Phoenician in style, in the way they're written. So that is the seal of Queen Jezebel. And we move to the New Testament. We have a couple things here. This is the Pool of Bethesda. And this comes up in John chapter 5. And this, of course, was the scene of one of Jesus' miracles. Now, this is actually a painting in the chapel at St. Anne's, which is a French Catholic church in the old city of Jerusalem. I was there also a couple of weeks ago, and this was a beautiful painting they had inside one of the chapels, which shows Jesus healing the lame man here at the Pool of Bethesda. Now, just to situate ourselves geographically within the city of Jerusalem, you have the Temple Mount here, which was the temple at this time of Herod during the New Testament times. Now the Dome of the Rock sits in this location with the Golden Dome. You have the pools are located north of the Temple Mount. And then you have, I'll just draw your attention here because we're going to go down here next, the Pool of Siloam, way down here on the south. So that's where the pools of Bethesda. Now here's another sort of mock-up. This is actually based on a full-scale model, which is located at the museum, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem now. And you can go and see this. And all the buildings are built up to the best knowledge we have archaeologically, historically, according to the first century, the time of Jesus. So you have the Temple Mount here. You have the Fortress Antonia, where the Roman soldiers were stationed. And then there's a Pool of Israel here. There's the eastern wall of the city of the old city of Jerusalem. And over here, you have Bethesda, it's like a two pool complex. So the book of John says, now in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, there is a pool which in Hebrew is called Bethesda, having 5 porticos. So John says there are 5 porticos. That's rows of columns that surround the pool. In these porticos lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, limping, or paralyzed. So he gives us a couple of clues and things to look for if we were to excavate someplace or find someplace of what it might look like. And here's a depiction of him healing the man. Now, a man was there who had been ill for 38 years. Jesus, upon seeing this man lying there and knowing that he had already been in that condition for a long time, said to him, "Do you want to get well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your pallet and walk." Immediately the man became well and picked up his pallet and began to walk. So here's again that model, and you can see all these giant people. Actually, you can get a sense of the scale of the model looking at these people that are looking in on it. You can't actually walk into it. You can just walk around it and look in. So you have here the Temple of Herod, and just to the north, here's the Fortress Antonia. And then this double pool complex, a northern pool and a southern pool, and then what would be the 5th portico here. So you have 4 sides, and then essentially a divider in between the 2 pools, which would be the 5th portico. And that's exactly what they found when they excavated here. There's a nice little blow up of it. And you notice that one is higher than the other. The northern pool is actually physically higher than the lower one. What Bethesda means itself is house of mercy or place of flowing water, which fits what we read about in the book of John. The northern pool actually began as a dammed up pool or reservoir known as the upper pool during Old Testament times, going back to the 8th century. So this is going down through from higher to lower ground as it comes down towards the temple in a little sort of, not a deep ravine, but sort of a depression where water would flow. And then they built a reservoir there with a dam. So that's how it began. Then in the lower pool was added about 200 BC. And in the 1st century BC, it may have functioned as an Asclepion, which is a Greek healing temple, which kind of fits with what the layman and others that would assemble there would assume were healing waters. So this kind of fits what we might expect to find there as an Asclepion. Now, more recent excavations suggest that the after this period of it could have been both actually, but it's probably more properly speaking in the Jewish faith, a mikvah, which is a ritual cleansing pool. So that would have been the lower basin. The upper basin would have been an otzer, which is what fed the lower pool. So what the requirements ritualistically for an otzer and a proper mikvah is that it has to be given by the hand of God. That is, it has to have a natural flow of water into the otzer, either by raining or by a stream or river, which would feed into it. And then the lower pool would be where the people would go in and do their ritual cleansing. This is, by the way, most people think is the forerunner to baptism, which was the practice of the Jews to ritually clean themselves before they would go up into the temple. Now, this is a large public mikvah, and there are others in the vicinity. In fact, the 2 largest ones that have been found are Bethesda and the Pool of Siloam. And these were necessary to accommodate large crowds of people that would come on the big feast holidays from all over the country. They would come to Jerusalem, the festivals of Passover and Sukkot and Shavuot. So they would then come, large numbers of people. They would have to be ritually cleansed in these large pools, and then they could go up into the temple precinct. Now, this is what it looks like today. It's down into a deep hole below the current level of Jerusalem. And they actually wouldn't let me go down there, even though there's a ladder that leads down there, but they had it all closed off and roped off. But you can look down and you can see some of the steps of this was part of the southern pool, the mikvah. And that dates to the 1st century. Now, I filmed another little video here, which is probably not going to hear it, but I'm looking over my shoulder and looking down into that deep area. Now, what has built up since then was, once it was abandoned, the Byzantines began, as I mentioned earlier with Queen Helen and Constantine, started to mark these holy sites. And this was another holy site that was marked. So the Byzantines actually built a church over top of the Pool of Bethesda. And then later on, the Crusaders came along and built another church on it. So this had the effect of building up layer upon layer over many centuries. So that's why it's looking so deep now, back to the 1st century levels. So we'll move on here and go to our final discovery, another very recent find, the Pool of Siloam. Now, this had several periods of occupation. This is, if we go back to the time of Hezekiah, about 700 BC, he cut a tunnel through solid rock below the city of David, where the Israelites were living at that time, from the spring of Gihon, which was the water source of ancient Jerusalem, through this rock-cut tunnel down to a pool down below the city in the area of Siloam. And this was all within the walled city. This was a way of securing the water source inside the city so it wouldn't be vulnerable to attack from besiegers or armies coming from the outside, from the east side in the Kidron Valley. So this has a Old Testament period. The tunnel that was cut through here, you see down here, you had the Gihon Spring, which is a perennial spring. It still flows today. You can walk through this tunnel where the water is still flowing. And then you emerge at the other end with the Pool of Siloam. So it had an Old Testament period, it had a New Testament period, and it had a Byzantine period as well. So here's another sort of mock-up of what it looked like at that time. Actually today, because it has the Dome of the Rock there, which is not that old, it's 7th century AD. But here's the Spring of Gihon. I have a little red arrow showing where that is, and that's open, but then it's cut into the tunnel, and it weaves its way through solid rock, and it empties out down here where the Pool of Siloam is. Now, this is what it looks like today from afar, and with some trees in the foreground. And looking along this is looking east towards the sort of the Mount of Olives, but you can see this is what we call monumental architecture. It's a large public structure with big stairways and lots of, it's something like 200 feet long. And here's looking the other direction. Now you notice it's running it's actually trapezoidal in shape. It's not rectangular. And half of it's still unexcavated because it's under a modern Greek Orthodox church yard. And unless they decide they want to dig up their churchyard, it will remain unexcavated. But it was actually found by accident back in 2004 when they were repairing some sewage pipes or something, and they came upon these stairs that started to emerge that indicated there was something significant there. So this is what it might have looked like back in its heyday, back in the 1st, 2nd centuries. Here it is with people standing around. And here he is healing the lame man. So it says, while I am in the world, I am the light of the world, Jesus says. When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes, to the man's eyes, and said to him, go wash in the Pool of Siloam. So he went away and washed and came back seeing. Therefore, the neighbors and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, is not this the one who used to sit and beg? And of course, after that, the Pharisees get wind of this, and they ask him, they interrogate him, saying, who did this to you, or who did this for you? He has no idea. He says, I don't know who he was, but all I know is that he came along and he did this, and now I can see. So this, of course, got the Pharisees quite irate, and this started to build their case against Jesus and his healings and his miraculous healings, which were not making them happy and threatening their power. So with that, I think we're right about out of time. I hope I didn't go too far over, Zach, but we've covered a couple of Old Testament finds and a couple of New Testament finds, all which are directly related to the things we read of in the Bible, and provide outstanding testimony to the truth of those things. So I'll finish there, and if you have any questions, fire away.
Another excellent presentation. We appreciate it very much. I'm actually going to leave questions. I wanted to engage our audience. So these videos will be going online on places where you can leave comments. So please do leave comments, questions, and we will do our best to have Dr. Janeway address them as they come in. You can do that by visiting our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and subscribing to the YouTube channel and liking the Facebook page. If you want to know more about these presentations, we plan to have more of these, maybe not necessarily over Zoom, some in person in the coming months. So visit plymouthmiami.org. And if you are interested in being on our mailing list, please email inquiries@plymouthmiami.org. All the information is in the description below. And please do leave questions or comments as you would like. So Dr. Janeway, thank you again for your time and your expertise. We are truly grateful.
Well, I'm grateful as well. I love the folks at Plymouth, and I look forward to seeing you guys in person again, because one of the best crowds I've ever had, most enthusiastic and interested and engaged. When I spoke there, it's now been 2 years ago, I think. But I look forward to doing that in person again. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And if you want to be part of that crowd, please follow us on the appropriate channels and subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.